Well, good evening, all. Tonight, the topic is how to raise children with unconditional love. But before we begin, I want to make it absolutely certain or sure that I do not have any children. So I'm not talking from experience. You know, I run into this situation often, is how can a priest give marriage counseling? Because we've never been married. How can I give advice on raising children? I've never had children. But what I'll share with you is what I've discovered about God, His unconditional love inside of me, the good news of Jesus Christ, and how that has affected my relationships. And I will take my grasp from that and transpose it into the process of raising children. But what I'll talk about tonight are the tools of the how to do it. You know, it's an amazing phenomenon, but we go to school and we learn how to read, we learn how to write, we learn how to spell, we learn all kinds of things about science, and maybe we can even get MAs and PhDs. But the amazing phenomenon, we can go to years of schooling and we never learn the tools of loving, which is the most important reality in our lives. See, the problem is we think just by being and existing it'll happen. But the realities of being able to love require tools just as much as math or science or spelling does. And so what I'd like to talk about tonight are the tools. And also I'd like to have you keep in mind when Jesus says those words, and it's in the marriage ceremony, whosoever God brings together, let no man put asunder. You remember that? That's a Christian marriage. That's the church's teaching against divorce. But it is concerned with a Christian marriage. And you see, a Christian marriage, the image of Jesus is a marriage of two people that are in the process of unconditional love, that love each other with unconditional love. And that's when the process of marriage can grow. And if people love each other with unconditional love, they can grow from anything. But the problem is, so often today, it's conditional love, which really isn't loving, but it's controlling. And so that's why the marriages don't work. And so what I'm saying about unconditional love, and I'll talk about it in a few minutes, has to begin with the couple themselves towards each other. But I want to have a few comments to make before I begin. You see, a family has to be a community. And the only time you can have a community is when people can trust their weaknesses to each other. A family is a community. See, we talk about in our society of the breakup of the family. And what we mean by that is the family isn't a community. And so we're getting down to a fundamental issue. Is Christianity real? Does it make a difference? Should it make a difference in our lives? Is love really possible in our families? And we get to that old idea of whether Jesus was an idealist that just put out ideas of how the world could be, or whether he gave us a real concrete spiritual program to live. Now there are two different scenarios, and I just want to give you an example of a person coming from a family with conditional love and a person coming to the family with unconditional love. If a child goes through the process of growing up, and in that process his parents love him for who he is as a person, and they really emphasize the inner values and not the outer, then the child grows up believing in their self-worth and their self-esteem. And when they move into adolescence, the child has a sense of right and wrong. The child has an identity. The child has a sense of who he is. And so he grows from what's happening. He's not manipulated. He's not owned by the peer group. He's not a product of the environment, but he has his own inner peace and inner meaning. And so when a person makes those decisions, they are decisions that come from inside. And so when he chooses his wife or she chooses her husband, it's a concrete adult decision. When they choose how to raise their children, it's a concrete decision that comes from inside. Now, if a child is raised with conditional love, what happens is that the child has to become what we use the word codependent. The child has to seek his meaning in people, places, and things. Because when he grew up, he was always trying to fulfill expectations. See, in a real sense, Parents are the gods of their children. In fact, a lot of work in Scott Peck's book, The Road Less Traveled, he mentions that when children are young, their parents are their gods. And so the parents have such power over their children. But if the parents set up standards, conditions that the kid has to fulfill in order to be loved, that child will always seek his meaning in people, places, and things. So when that child moves into adolescence, now their God is the peer group. And that's where they find their meaning. And so everything in their life becomes a conditioning from outside. I mentioned this, I think, during the parish mission, but how I really saw how this effect was on me is my whole life, my preoccupation with self was always, no matter what was happening, no matter what talk I was given or what audience I was talking to, I was always worried, do people like me? I was preoccupied with that because I needed to get my meaning from outside. So that's the difference between growing up with conditional love and unconditional love. Now, I want to begin my main talk with 2 points. The first is this, that you can't give what you don't have. And so whatever I'm saying tonight, if you're going to give it away to your children, you have to have that sense inside of you. You have to have a faith in the good news of Jesus Christ. I don't mean a perfect faith, but a growing faith of God's unconditional love inside. You can't give it to your kids if you don't have it. And so, in terms of things we talked about at the parish mission, is if a parent emphasizes the external world and their own lives, what's important is the outside, they're going to emphasize that in their children's lives. If parents emphasize the inner journey, what's going on inside of them, the God within in their own lives, they're going to emphasize that with their children. So whatever I say, no matter how much you hear, you can't give it away if you don't first have it inside. And so when I'm talking about children's parents always have to realize that. I want to say another note too, because it's a real situation. Suppose now one parent has a real spiritual program and the other parent doesn't, which can be a reality. What to do? Well, what I suggest is that my experience in life, whenever, say, I was in a Jesuit community and there was one negative person, I always found in the immediate situation that negativity always has a greater influence on what happens. You follow what I'm saying? Negativity always seems to be I'm more aware of negativity than I am of something positive. But in the long run, it's always the goodness that has affected me more than the negativity. I found that in my life. And so what I'm saying, in the immediate situation, negativity often seems much more powerful. But in the long range of the journey, the positive always wins out. So I want to stress if you're in that situation. And I want to also make a point, too, that children, in growing up, seem to be much better if they're from a broken home than in a broken home. The chances of kids growing. That sometimes, and it's a misconception, that parents just stay together for the kids. And as a result, they argue and they fight, and the home is a constant turmoil. That always does much more damage in the long run to children than if they're raised by one children and have visitation rights. There's a chance they can have a good relationship with each parent in a better way than growing up in the broken home. There's a lot more damage done over the long range. Now, I also want to make a point, too, that if unconditional love is very essential as a help in a person's journey, but it's not crucial. No matter if we've been raised with conditional love, we still have the living God within us. And God is still working in our lives. So it makes a difference. It's even like in my situation. I grew up in a dysfunctional family, but my parents had a lot of love. Even though it was conditional, it was a lot of love there. I had a lot of problems I've had to work out in my life because of that conditional love. But you know, because there was love, it made it a lot easier. So what I want to stress in the beginning, we don't live in a perfect world. It's progress, not perfection. We'll never have perfect unconditional love for ourselves, for our children, for our husband or our wife. But all we ask is it's becoming more unconditional as we grow. And you know, that's what I discover in a lot of marriages. I discover people are happier in their latter years, those that have worked through their relationship, than in their latter years of marriage. Their love is much more unconditional than it was in the beginning, because they've been growing in their marriage. So I want to say those points before I begin my talk about children. Well, if you notice, children when they're young, they're very precious. You know, I go and I have people I know that have little babies, and I just go and I just marvel at their inner beauty, at their smile and their laughter. They're just beautiful. But they only have one problem. They're self-centered. The world centers around them. You know, if I work 10 hours a day, my baby doesn't seem to worry about that when it wants to cry at 2 in the morning. You know? It just wants to cry, it'll cry. The world centers around the child. When the child cries, the child expects the parents to come running. The parents are the servants of the child. Well, there's a process that has to happen, because a child, you know, we talk about you're just being a baby. You know, we use that expression. Well, what we mean is an adult is acting just like a baby. So there's a process, as parents see with their children, that their children have to grow and grow away from this selfishness, this self-centeredness, and grow to share their love and care, be concerned and thoughtful about others. Now the trick or the challenge is, how does that child grow to being concerned about others and dying to the self-centeredness without destroying the inner person? That's the key. How does a child grow without destroying the beautiful child, the little baby that was inside of him? You follow what I'm saying? That's the challenge. Now I think a way that I'll just begin tonight is feelings are very important. And it's very important with our children that we learn as they grow to listen to their feelings. You know that old saying is, don't feel that way? Well, that's conditional love. You know, a little child will come up and say, Mommy, I hate you. Don't say that. What we're doing is we're putting conditional love on the child. We're saying that it's not okay to feel this way. And so a very important beginning in raising a child is really learning to listen to the children's feelings, because that comes from inside. And that means when you listen to a child, you've got to listen without an agenda. Because when we listen to a child, and the child is all that's important, and really listen to what's going on inside of the child, we're communicating to the child how precious they are. When we deny their feelings, we're denying their preciousness. And you see, that's how we build communication. Piaget, who is probably the foremost child psychiatrist in the world today, I don't know if he's still living now, but his books are considered the uppermost. He says a child begins to develop their own will when they're about 2 years old, 2 and 3 years old. He did all kinds of studies that when you ask children, why does the sun shine, or why do the trees grow? The usual answer a child will give, because it wants to. Which means the child has to have an experience of its own freedom, its own choice. In transactional analysis, in Harris's book, I'm Okay, You're Okay, he talks about the parent that's inside of us, all the oughts and shoulds and musts that are put in there by the parent, the child in us, the emotions, the play, and then the adult in us, the one that decides whether it's appropriate to be an adult or appropriate to be a child. He maintains through his studies that that begins at 18 months of age. So what I want to stress is our little child, as it's growing, there's a real little person in there with real feelings and real power of choices. And so how we relate to that person and how we listen is so important with that child, of showing how precious we feel that child is. And so what I want to stress is very often from our hectic world, you know, we're running around, you're probably sitting there saying, Father, that sounds wonderful, but have you ever raised 4 kids and tried to sit down and listen to them? You know? Well, what I'm saying is sometimes we have to have a program of really maybe cooling off or quieting ourselves down so that we can really give attention to our relationship with our child. See, what I probably have to stress in this is relationships have to be our highest value if we're ever going to be spiritual. A father, he may consider his job to be so important because that's what pays the bills. But in his priority of energy, his highest priority is not being a father to support the kids, but being a father as a person to the kids. The mother may consider mothering, cooking, keeping the house clean, and taking care of all those, keeping the house together is her main function. But her primary, highest priority is to be a person to her children. Because that's how we convey how important they are. You know, I can still remember when I was a child, you know, you have memories you go back to. I can remember driving with my father as a little child and talking away. But I always knew my father's mind was many miles away, being concerned about his business or the worries of business and that sort of thing. I can still feel that as a child, how I felt then. So I want to stress that we've got to really understand when our children begin to talk about their feelings, to really listen to what they're saying and what's behind their feelings. That's crucial. Because, for example, when a child says to their mom, I hate you, see, love and hate are twins. The people we love the most we hate. That's very normal. When the child doesn't get its own way from someone they love, they're going to hate that person. So it's not something the child, it's a very normal flow in the experience. But you've got to understand the reason behind it. And when you really listen to the child, well, I'll talk about it a little bit more in communication, how you can respond. As I mentioned when I gave the parish mission, we can always tell, and that's so important from the child when they're young too, even when they're small. If we really love someone, our challenge with them is going to be for them to grow. We're not going to make them dependent on us. And that begins early when I talk about the whole reality of pain. When children are in pain, the worst thing we can do as parents is take the pain away instead of helping them to grow from it. You see what so oftentimes people think good parenting is taking pain away from their children. So when the child is crying, give them a lollipop. Or I know so many times parents, I had my sister, she took care of her kid until she was 6. Every 1 o'clock in the morning, she'd bring her milk. You know, she'd get up, set the alarm to give the child milk because the child was lonely. Well, you see, she was protecting the child from growing. And she was also losing a lot of sleep and wondering why she was cranky. But that takes responsibility to begin to help the child grow and not protect the child. A reality always with children is we've got to teach them that they have to pay the consequences of their behavior. See, that's being honest with them. That's helping them to grow. That's preparing them to live and be creative in the real world. But when we don't let them pay the consequences of their behavior, we're not teaching them about truth. And that's why oftentimes, you know, I found this true in parents when because I observe a lot in seeing families. A key when you're raising children, if you want your children to listen, is whenever you say anything, to mean it. The trouble with our fast-paced world is we don't take the time to use the tools. And so what happens? This conditional love just happens in the kid's life. Now I want to talk about the children in terms of guilt and shame. You know that old saying of love the sinner and hate the sinner and hate the sin? Well, I'll tell you, that may sound fine, but in reality, it doesn't always work. And you see, there's a big difference between feeling guilty and feeling filled with shame. See, you can forgive guilt, but you can't forgive shame. Shame means I'm worthless or I'm a mistake. See, there's a big difference between saying I am a mistake and I did a mistake. And you see, the big problem is when our children are growing up and they do something that doesn't please us, that we communicate to them that Mommy doesn't love you when you do that. We communicate to them that they're a mistake. And what happens is a little child begins to build shame inside of them. You can always tell the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt are things we can process, we can forgive ourselves and move on. But whenever you do something wrong, and you get that dark cloud that starts in your feet and moves up through your whole body, and you feel terrible all over, that's shame. And that's passed on from parents to children. And I can't estimate how much devastation that does to a person. We call that person a shame-based person. And you see, in my generation of growing up, is what happened a lot of times in the family when you were made to feel like you were a mistake when you were growing up. Then I got it from the family, and the way I grew up in the school, I got it often in the school that when you did this, you were no good. I often heard it from the pulpit. So you see, it could be a shame base in an individual. And you see, that's very difficult to handle when a person gets to be an adult. Because you ask them to learn to forgive themselves, but they can't forgive themselves when they think they're a mistake. So that's very crucial. And this is what I want to stress in understanding that. The tremendous difference between approving someone and accepting someone. See, what happens most of the time, we unite the two together. That in order to accept you, I have to approve you. And so when I don't approve of you, I don't accept you. And so when a child does something wrong that we don't approve, then we don't accept the child. But they're not the same reality. There are many people in my life that I've loved and loved them dearly, but everything they did, I didn't approve of. In fact, I don't know of anybody in my life that I approve of everything they do. But I accept them. So even when I don't approve, I still accept them. And they know I accept them. But people know when you don't accept them. Because you make them feel like they're worthless. They're not good. Do you follow me when I'm saying that? That's so crucial. Now I want to stress another thing. It's very important as we raise our children that we don't let the black book accumulate. Because if there are things that our child does that we don't grow from or deal with or help the child to grow from, then we write it in our little black book. And then when they do something wrong, we get all mad at them, but we never can resolve it because we're not mad at just what they did, we're mad at the whole history. And that's devastating because you can't have a relationship of love with someone you have a black book on. And so it's very important that as you deal with the issues of your child's life, that you resolve the issue as best you can in the relationship and you resolve it within yourself. That you don't hang on to it or you don't bury it. Because that's what happens so often in the child's journey as they go, and I'm going to, at the end of my talk about adolescence and how to deal with this in adolescence. But the problem is, so much can be written in the black book that there's no way we can deal with the person. And you can always tell when you have unconditional love with someone. Because you may get angry at them, but you're always angry at just the situation. You're not angry at a whole history. And so you know that old saying that don't ever let the anger go down, or don't ever let the sun go down in your anger. And there's a lot of truth in that. That whenever there are issues in our family lives, that we work it through before the next day begins. And we feel at peace with it. Because I'll tell you, it's devastating, that black book. Because you can never have a relationship of love with someone you have a black book on, because there's too much anger. I also want to stress now, in terms of raising the child, of emphasizing the inner values and not the outer values. To emphasize honesty, care for others, thoughtfulness, growing from things. Those are the important values. Because that's what you're going to convey to your child, what's most important in their life, by what you consider important. The child's going to internalize that. If the thing that you really give your child the strokes for, the highest strokes, are the child's honesty, the child's growth, the child's thoughtfulness of others, the child's going to see that as most important in his life. Those are inner values. Or if you're going to emphasize grades, achievements, that's what your child's going to emphasize. You know, a principal recently told me that they did a survey in the 8th grade, and they asked the kids what they want most in life. And you know what the answer was? To make a lot of money. Where do you think that came from? Those were what was emphasized in the child's growth. But you see, it takes time and energy and awareness to deal with what's inside of a child and listen to that, rather than emphasize the external behavior. What's behind the behavior? I had a recent example of and that's why I spend quality time. A father was just all excited because he had a breakthrough in his family. His 5th grader came home, they had changed schools, and she came home and she was really crying, she was very sad because she didn't have any friends in the school. And you know, we have the tendency to give a cliche or to brush it off, or it'll get better, you know, those kind of sayings. Well, he really spent time with her and listened to her and sympathized with her. And then he said to her, he said, why don't you, honey, just go tomorrow and just meet one kid in the school and be nice and see if you can make one friend tomorrow. And you know, she did. And she came home and she was all excited to tell her father. But I thought to myself when he shared it with me, what's the difference between that parent who took the time to be there and to really listen, and the parent who was too busy, that gave a cliche or just, you know, it'll get better tomorrow? What a difference. To really listen to what's going on inside of the child and respond. You see, I think that we can appeal to the child's higher sense or deeper person in a way. I recently was babysitting. I babysit, believe it or not. And I'm a good one. But I was babysitting a child. It was 2 years old, a very active child. And it was about 9 o'clock at night, and I had just gotten back from a mission, and I was a little tired. And you know, people have a hard time with this baby sometimes, especially the mother. And I said, you know, I said, honey, I said, I'm awful tired tonight. I've been working hard. And boy, you could make it so nice for me if you could just, you know, just lie up here on the couch with me, and we'll both go to sleep. And you know, it was a big couch, and the baby went right to sleep, and I went right to sleep. But you know what happened? I appealed to the child's highest sense, to the person inside of him. And I thought, what a difference than yelling and screaming at the child. If you don't go to bed now, I'm going to give you a spanking. What I used to do is give him $1, but the kid was too young for that. But I want to show you the emphasis of placing the value on the inner person and appealing to that. You know, I think, you know, children have a lot of love inside of them. And they want to be loved. And they want to love mommy and daddy. They want to love. And I think when we appeal to that and take the time to reach that in our relationship, we're emphasizing the spiritual values. And that's why, you know, I doing an awful lot in high school work for many, many years. And I just saw so much pressure externally put on kids. You know, I used to get so upset. I sure recommended against it. Parents that give cars to their kids if they get A's, or, you know, almost bribing them to do something valuable for themselves because they put such high priority on it. You know, or achievements, or making a football team, or all these, because what we're conveying to them is this is what makes you worthwhile. It's not that those aren't important, but they're not the highest importance, the highest priority. You know what I remember, and just a thought that came to me, when I worked at a school and teachers were having a hard time, sometimes you'd have a teacher that the students couldn't control. I mean, we're going to have to cut that from the tape. Sometimes you have, those are good teachers. But sometimes you have students that the teacher can't control. And you know, I was vice principal. I was in charge of discipline. And you know, I'd make it a point, when I'd tell the teacher to leave, and I'd go in and I'd talk to the kids. And I talk about the teacher's dedication. Maybe the teacher doesn't have all the gifts in the world, but the teacher's there every day. And the teacher's trying as hard as they can. And I appeal to the kid's inner person. And I was amazed at the response I got from the kids. They heard that. But you know, if I went in there and said, if you kids don't straighten up, you're all going to be in jug for a month. You know? What a difference. What a difference in terms of response. Whether we appeal to their higher self or their lower self. I'd also want to stress that it's very important with children in loving them unconditionally is really encourage the child's uniqueness. You know, all children have certain gifts. And to really see them as special gifts from God, I think every one of us has some area in which we're special. And I think what parents should do is really encourage their child to be unique and to be their own person instead of being worried because they're not like everyone else. I know sometimes parents come to me, they're so upset my child hasn't dated yet and they're in the 7th grade. Well, everybody else is dating. You know? I think that we can stress, we can put too much pressure that we expect them to be just like everyone else. And I think when we emphasize their uniqueness, we emphasize that they're a special person. And I think all of this comes down to the fact that what we're encouraging is we're really encouraging them to believe of the God within. And what this section of what I want to talk about, I want to really stress whether we emphasize a God in the sky or a God that's inside of them. And you see, very often, parents will use the God in the sky to reinforce their discipline. God's going to punish you if you do this. Or God doesn't love you when you do this. But I think the important thing, and this is the difference between the inner and the outer, is that we emphasize that the God lives within them, that love inside of them is their experience of God. And that's what has to be nurtured. They have a kingdom inside, which especially makes them precious. And I think we can do that with young children and help them develop that sense of the God within. See, that's what a lot of kids leave, or when they leave a sense of God, when they get in their adolescence or later on, because it's a God up there. And their God up there doesn't work anymore. And so when they get the sense of God's unconditional love inside of them. So instead of saying, God's going to punish you for that, God's going to help you grow from it. That God is there to help you grow. That love that's inside of you will never abandon you. Because I think it's important from the kids' earliest years to help them understand that you're only a guest in my home. That you've got to travel your own journey. That we're here as your parents to help guide you and help nurture you and help direct you. But you've got to travel your own journey. And what we're going to try to do is give you the tools and the help to be able to do that. I think that emphasis of what's inside is so crucial. So what I've tried to do for the first 40 or so minutes tonight is to give some points for children, especially. What I'd like to do now, in my last 20 minutes or so, is to talk about teenagers and how to apply that to teenagers, what I've been saying. One thought, though, before I get into that, is it's very important that we don't grow up in our family with silent praise. I mentioned that during the mission. But it's very important that we become very attuned to appreciating the qualities in a person, that we let them know, that we stroke people when they do thoughtful things and good things. We don't just presume they're going to do it. I had a father, it was amazing, I've given retreats, 2 retreats over the last year, and the last one I talked about the 5 report cards, when my dad looked at it and said, "Why didn't you get 6?" Well, he had a child that was somewhat of a high achiever, and the dad came to me at the time and he said, "You know, I'm that way with my kid." Well, he told me last Sunday when I gave the retreat, he said, "My kid came home and had only 3 A's. And I looked at the card and said, "That's really fine, son. I'm really proud of you." And you know something? That's the kid went and framed the card. And it's the only one he's ever framed in his room. Because that was the only time when his father said, "Hey, you know, I'm really proud that you're my son." So I think that's very important, that we just don't let people know when they do something wrong, but we really emphasize when they do something right. Now, the last suggestion before I get into the teenagers for the 3rd time is, you know what I really recommend to get serious and build a program in a family? I really recommend that you put one of those jars in your kitchen. And when anybody in the family plays a guilt game on someone else in the family, it can be brother to sister, it could be husband to wife, it could be mother to daughter, father to son. But whenever we play a guilt game, and I mean the silent treatment, the pouting, the martyr trip, all those things in which we try to make people feel guilty, that's conditional love. That's controlling. That's people trying to control each other. Now, it's a habit for many of us, that as soon as somebody injures us, we do that to them. I really recommend that you get your family very aware of it. Every time somebody does it on one another, they put a quarter in it. And what you will do is you will start having the family, right from the little girl, 3-year-old that pouts. Maybe she gets 50 cents allowance a week. She's got to put a quarter in. But what it will help do is help people become aware of conditional love in the family and how we punish one another, because that's what destroys community. We wonder why kids can't talk to each other, or they become enemies, or whatever happens. See, that whole sense of how people deal with guilt instead of forgiving. In fact, you know, I have a new thought in my mind. I haven't completely worked it out, but I've stopped saying to people, "I forgive you." What I'm saying now is, "I accept you." Because when I say I forgive you, it's like I'm better than you are. But when I say I accept you, it means I accept you as a human being that isn't perfect. And I love you that way. But anyway, I'd suggest that for the family as a way of really implementing a good, sound policy of unconditional love. And then send me to life's journey the money that's left in the jars. And I'll be richer than Jim and Tammy Baker. Now let me talk about teenagers, how to love them unconditionally. First of all, we got to accept, if any of you have teenagers, that there's probably been a lot of conditional love. There's a lot of black books by the time the child has gone into adolescence. There's a lot of conflict. You know how you can tell how much conditional love there is in a family when a child gets into adolescence? Is all you have to do is to see if your child, when they get to that point, lies much. Because a lot of times when children lie, it's because they don't think they can be accepted if they told the truth. And they're almost coerced into lying through conditional love. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. I think the first thing, if you have teenagers, is you have to get underneath their skin. And you have to walk around in it for a while. And you know what the best way to start is get underneath your own skin when you were an adolescent. What was it like for you? Experience. It's amazing how many adults forget what their own adolescence was by the time they have their own adolescence. But when you get underneath your own skin and you know your own experience as a teenager, then you turn the knob of pressure up about 90%. And that's what your kids are living in. You know, as I've mentioned, there's no way I'd want to be 16 today. Only if they gave me all the knowledge I've learned in the meantime. No way. You know, I can remember when I was growing up, there was so much I could count on. You know, the good nuns, the church, the family, America. Everything was so simple. You know, I can remember when I grew up in the family, all the neighbors knew each other. We played together. All the kids played on the block together. We played cowboys and Indians and army and later on sports. But it was so simple. You know, I can even tell the difference today. And this is only my own opinion. But I used to have wonderful Christmases. And there was a lot of spirituality to them. I just don't think people enjoy Christmas like they used to, as I experience it. Just like we don't enjoy a lot of things like we used to. These kids have a hard time today, teenagers. And I think it's very important for a parent to have some understanding as a backdrop to loving them. Now, I believe that for a relationship to grow between parent and child, when adolescence comes along is a time, and it's a process. It doesn't happen all at once. But when a parent begins to become more of a friend than a parent. Because adolescents need a safe place today more than kids have ever needed one. They need to be able to come home and have a shoulder to cry on. You know the three qualities of a friend? A friend has a brain that you can pick, a shoulder you can cry on, and they have a right to give you a kick when you need it. That's what a friend is. And I think today, kids need their parents to be their friends. Now, this is what I would suggest on the part of a parent. I think a parent today, to reunite a relationship with an adolescent, two things are very important. I think there's nothing wrong for a parent to ask forgiveness from their child for maybe some of the unconditional love, maybe some of the emphasis on the external things. But to really say, hey, I'm sorry, I did the best I could, but I want to grow. I want to grow in unconditional love. I want us to relate as a family. I want us to be a community. But I ask your forgiveness for the past. I think that that's a key step. And then I think parents have to explain why they're so fearful. See, I think just like the parents have to get underneath the skin of the parents, I think the kids have to get under, or the parents have to get underneath the skin of the kids. I think the kids have to get underneath the skin of the parents. I think it's important for kids to know the fear and the pressure that is going on in their parents today with their kids. And really, I think the kids would be the same way if they understood it. I think the important thing for parents to explain, hey kids, you know, with all the drugs and alcohol today and all the problems with AIDS, with abortions and pregnancies, it's happening all around us, and I'm afraid. And sometimes when I'm afraid, I control. I think parents have to explain that it's coming out of love, out of concern. It's because I'm afraid of what will happen. But I think it's very important for the parents to get underneath the skin of the children and understand it, and for the children to get underneath the skin of the parents. But they'll never know if you don't communicate it to them. But it's not in a lecture form or a sermon. It's sharing your vulnerability. Hey, sometimes I just don't know what to do. I'm so afraid because I love you so much. But that sounds so much more beautiful than a lecture or sermon, because a person is being vulnerable, risking being himself or herself with his children. That's the first point I'd make with adolescents. The second is this. You know the model that I used with teenagers when I was high school disciplinarian? I didn't have a lot of rules and in fact, I treated all the kids differently. I hated that thing, you know, if I treat you this way, I have to treat everybody this way. I never operated that way, because every kid is an individual. And you know what I noticed? If kids had a sense of right and wrong, if they had an inner person, a sense of self, I gave that kid a lot of freedom because I had faith in that kid. But if I saw that kids didn't have a sense of right and wrong, they didn't have a sense of the person inside of them. In other words, they were what anybody wanted them to be. They were so much owned by the peer pressure. I had to have a lot of rules and regulations for that kid. And I explained it to him, because I had to protect you. I have to help you until you get a sense of right and wrong, just for what can happen. And so I talked to the kids about whether you're going to give me reason to have faith or reasons to have fear. But the worst thing I could always do is put an oppressive person or restrictions on someone who is trying to grow. You know, I think that was so important. And, you know, it was unbelievable, the experiences that, you know, there's some parents that just as soon not know what's happening, because what they don't know doesn't hurt them. And, you know, it would just be devastating to some of the things that happen that parents would, because they didn't take the time with their teen. It's almost like when they get to be teenagers, you know, I'll just let them go. There used to be parties that kids would have that the girls wouldn't get home till 6, 7 in the morning when they had booze or beer or that at those parties. And I just looked at myself and I said, my God, you know, how can parents do that? And then they wonder why their kids get into trouble. So what I want, I want to take the point, we've got to set boundaries. But the boundaries, and what kind of boundaries we're going to have, is whether the child conveys to us that we can have faith in them, or we have to have fear. And you know, you may wonder a lot of times whether you have to have all the answers with your kids. You don't have to. You know, I think that you don't have to be the expert on everything. You've got to be able to say you don't know at times. And there's a lot of things there aren't answers for today. And I think that's important to convey to your child. You're not the expert on everything, but you're there to help them grow through. That's why I think so much better than giving lectures and sermons. You know, all of us have been on the journey, and we all have grown from things in our life. And I think that one of the greatest gifts we give to our children is when we share with them how we have grown from things, instead of telling them how they can grow from things. You know, they have a wonderful system in the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous. They have a system where you never tell anybody what to do, because they have a basic belief that when you tell anybody what to do, they're going to do the opposite. And so their system is you share your experience, your hopes. And then when people hear that, then they're not becoming defensive. They hear it and apply it for their own lives. Now, very often with teenagers, if you don't like your teenager, and there are periods, I've had many parents tell me, I love my child, but I don't like him. And sometimes parents can feel very guilty about that. But you know, if somebody doesn't like themselves, we can't like them. We really can only like a person to a degree that they like themselves. And there are periods when kids go through a tremendous period of not liking themselves. They have no self-esteem. And I think that if we ever run into the situation with our teenagers that we really can honestly say that we don't like them, I think it's really a message that we have to find a strategy to help them develop some self-esteem. You know how I did it with teenagers as vice principal? I took over from a guy who believed in negative punishment. So when kids got in trouble, he always had them write out the telephone book or memorize poetry. And they hated him. So when I became vice principal, it's always easy to follow somebody that they hate. You know what I made the punishments for the kids always? Positive. Whenever anybody did, you know, parents, a kid would get caught drinking at a dance or something, and the parents would come down in my office and they said, that kid is not going to go out of his room for a month. Won't get a car for 6 weeks. I'll fix him. And I always said, you know, the kid, he's done something wrong. He doesn't have much self-esteem. The child doesn't feel very good about himself. When you put him in his room or take the car away or take away the things he enjoys, you're only going to make the self-esteem worse. And so probably the next thing he does is even going to be worse. I used to encourage him. Maybe you have a backyard that needs some cleaning or trimming or lawn mowed, or maybe you need the garage to be cleaned out. Give him something positive to do so he can restore the imbalance he's caused in the family by doing some sort of restitution to the family. I always gave kids a positive punishment. When they caused disruption in the school, I always gave them a chance to do something positive in the school. I gave them something to help them feel good about themselves instead of worse about themselves. You see, I think oftentimes in our families we take the notion of punishment the same as we take the notion of prison. We've got to put them in their own prison. Now, I'm running out of time for my talk. I just want to give you some examples, some concrete things, practical things that, in terms of teenagers. Suppose now you have teenagers that don't want to go to church anymore. Now, I've often heard the system of, as long as you're in my house, you're going to do what I say. Well, that's a great approach. You know what happens often? You're going to make the kid hate church even more. You know what I think the important thing, and this is the example of unconditional love, is really get the kid to question. What is he saying? What is he saying about his experience of God now, his Christian faith? But you don't do it in a defensive way of getting him to argue. You just want to bring out, what is the kid saying about his point in the journey? You might want to ask him about rebellion and just his own identity, maybe breaking away. But I think it's important that this is listening without an agenda. This is loving instead of controlling. See, we've got to get it out of our heads that we can control anyone into doing anything. We can't. You can't control someone and love them at the same time. It's impossible. And I think when the child really sees that we care how he feels about it and what's going on in his life, it's a whole different attitude than we bring in a tyrant. Do you see the difference? Makes all the difference in the world. How about if our kid has unhealthy friends? You know, that can often be an issue. Kid, we don't like you playing with that kid. Don't play with that kid. You're not to bring that kid home anymore. I don't want you to ever see you with them. You know? Think of the difference now. You know, the only real freedom I think that children have, see, they don't choose their family. At least I don't believe so. They don't usually choose the school they go to. They don't choose their teachers. They don't choose the church they go to or the priest that preaches the sermons. You know, the real freedom that children have is they choose their friends. And you know, parents used to come to me and they used to say, how's my kid doing? And I used to say, well, just look at your kid's friends. When the person that the people I choose for my friends is the person I'm becoming. And so, you know, it would really be good to kind of reflect on this with your child. What are the values that are important in your life? What is this saying about your journey? But challenging in a personal, caring way, rather, and helping the kid become reflective instead of being a tyrant. When I used to have to suspend kids, and that's always a step before expulsion in a school, you know what my form of suspension was? I used to give the kids 10 questions, and I used to have to answer them, reflect on them. And there were questions about the kid's personal life. Who were his friends? And what would he be like if 10 years from now, if he keeps going the way he's going? What is his contribution to his family? Is this a better school because he's here? I get the kid to reflect upon his personhood. And my last question was always, how did you like this assignment? And then I talked to the kid about it. And you know something? Almost in every case, and those were the kids just ready to be expelled, in every one of those cases I had a really good discussion with the kids, and I think it really helped at their journey to see where they were. And I used to think to myself, what a difference between that type of an approach than giving them 400 lines to memorize. I hope you're seeing what I'm trying to say in terms of an attitude. It's an attitude. It's whether I'm going to control the person or whether I'm going to really listen and care. I want to just talk about if a child's grown up in an alcoholic home or workaholic, any of the compulsive behaviors. I think it's extremely important to really educate your children to the likelihood that they may have the disease. You know, among the people that do work with alcoholics or drug addicts or whatever, if you have 4 kids, the likelihood 2 of them will become alcoholics. And the other 2 will probably marry alcoholics. But it's a family disease, and it seems to be inherited. And I think it's extremely important that this becomes a real awareness in a child's life from the beginning. That any experience that they have with alcohol or drugs can be very dangerous. And that's where a lot of the programs, the 12-step program of Alateens, is very important. But I think if there's alcohol, it could be on any side of the family. If either the husband or wife have it, or if it's an immediate family, it's a very important education that has to happen within the family. And it's very important that the kids become educated to it. And you become very aware of it. Well, that's what I have to say tonight.